Even when a pork industry developed in the 1850s, it was dependent on nature and the seasons. As grain was shipped to St. Louis, pigs were shipped to Cincinnati by river. Plants were busy in the winter, idle in the summer, when meat was likely to spoil. Chicago turned this world on its head. Railroads bypassed the rivers to divert hogs to Chicago. Packers like Gurdon Hubbard found a way to bypass the seasons, to turn summer into winter.
They begin cutting ice on the streams, rivers, ponds around Chicago, and then eventually in Indiana and Illinois and Wisconsin, and bringing that ice down to Chicago so that the pork packing factories can be kept open all year long.
Boosted by pork sales to the Union Army in the Civil War, Chicago surpassed Cincinnati as Porkopolis by 1862. Hogs from the Midwest funneled into its Union stockyards, which opened Christmas Day, 1865, and soon had 2,300 pens for 75,000 hogs. What they faced next was a process that would change American industry, and it smelled.
The smell in the holding pens, of course, was incredible. But the smell of the processing is what most people really remember, because that processing smell is what permeated everything. My mother used to say that you'd never die of pneumonia because no germs could live in your lungs if you grew up in back of the yards. I grew up in the back of the yards, and the smell never really bothered me because it was always there. The first time I went out as a young boy, they took us out on a picnic to the country. I got sick because I smelled fresh air. It was so strange.
The Hereford wheel was invented in Cincinnati. Chicago packers perfected it. Shackled by a hind leg, the hogs were lifted into the air. A sticker would then slit their throats. They were so excessively alive, these pigs, poet Rudyard Kipling would write. And then they were so excessively dead. And the man in the dripping, clammy, hot passage did not seem to care. And ere the blood of one had ceased to foam on the floor, another, and 4 friends with him, had shrieked and died.
When the Hereford wheel is introduced, the hog kill becomes the loudest kill in the packing houses. Pigs are very intelligent. When that Hereford wheel grabbed them, they know something's going on. And they let out a blood-curdling, incredible scream.
From the kill to the cutlets, pork packing developed into a labor-intensive, lightning-fast disassembly line.
In about 15 minutes, the hog goes through this process of passing about 125 or 150 people, depending on the packing house. And you've got, by the turn of the century, meat packing houses in Chicago that are killing 5,000-6,000 hogs a day, which would be the whole week's kill in a previous generation. The largest run of hogs, the Union stockyards, was about 190,000 hogs in one day.
The largest of the pork packers was Armour & Company, which shipped all over the world. "I give more people food than any other man alive," Philip Armour told his sons.
He has a pork packing empire of global scope, and he can keep in communication with it through the transatlantic cable, which is laid in the 1860, telegraph line, and the telephone. So you can now run a global industry. We always think of the great global industries as oil and steel, but the first of these great global industries is pork packing.
Son of a farmer from Stockbridge, New York, Philip Armour was tossed out of school for taking a buggy ride with a girl. He joined the gold rush in California and made enough to enter the grain and pork business in Milwaukee. He poured his profits into a packing plant alongside the Union stockyards and undermined packers like Gurdon Hubbard, who could not compete. Philip Armour was all business.
He'd get up in the morning, eat a simple breakfast, read all the reports, be in the office at 6:30 in the morning. If you came in after 9 o'clock, he'd greet you with a booming, "Good afternoon." And he said he'd get there before 9 o'clock. He said before the guys with the polished nails get there. He says that's when the work gets done. And he was bouncing around from desk to desk, and he had his finger in every aspect of the business. And this is the business that made Chicago. This is what it was known for, hog butcher of the world. And Armour was the epitomization of that sort of thing.
In Philip Armour's Chicago, they did it straight, Norman Mailer would write. They cut the animals right out of their hearts, which is why it was the last of the great American cities. And people had great faces, carnal as blood, greedy, direct, too impatient for hypocrisy, in love with honest plunder. The Chicago packing houses became the largest killing fields in the world, and Chicago's foremost tourist attraction. A person could visit the grain elevators or lumber yards without pondering their meaning. Not the stockyards. Here they realized the familiar world of the pig, the pasture, and the butcher they knew was gone, replaced by the cold-hearted mechanization of slaughter. Dissection so complete that, as Philip Armour said, nothing was left but the squeal.
And you wonder what it was that would make that an attractive thing for a tourist to see. And yet, this was new. This was the modern. This was the Industrial Revolution at its most dramatic, its starkest. And I think people went there both to be repelled by it, both to be horrified on the one hand, but also to wonder at what this age had accomplished and what was happening to the world as a result.
The disassembly line repelled novelist Upton Sinclair. One could not stand and watch very long without becoming philosophical, he wrote in The Jungle, without beginning to hear the hog squeal of the universe. It intrigued Henry Ford. In the disassembly line of the Chicago Packers, he wrote in his autobiography, he found the inspiration for the assembly line for his Model T. Chicago developed as a trading center, a crossroads between producers and buyers. At first, they traded what was present in the city. Hogs were bought and sold at the Union stockyards. Grain traders developed a board of trade where they bought and sold receipts for grain deposited in the elevators by the river. A telegraph in the trading room gave New York buyers instant market reports. They bought grain in the elevators for future delivery. Speculators then developed a futures market. A buyer in New York could buy for future delivery Chicago hogs or grain that did not yet exist. It was a market not in hogs, but in the future price of hogs. One bought or sold not wheat or corn, but gambled on their prices at a future date. As one historian explained, the futures market was a place where men who don't own something are selling that something to men who don't really want it.
Go to the Chicago Board of Trade today, and you will see one of the most extraordinary monuments to world capitalism that you can see anywhere on Earth. It's an amazing scene. What will be happening down on that floor are people buying and selling commodities and products from ecosystems and economies all over the world, setting prices that determine the future for people all over the world. And yet, You look at it and you don't have a clue all the elements that are coming together there. It is where the world connects in the modern age, and it is where that connection is rendered invisible in the modern age.
Cholera came into the United States in 1849 through the port of New Orleans and crept up the Mississippi, the Illinois River, and the canal toward Chicago.
It's a devastating disease. And it's very difficult to watch someone with cholera because they become violently ill and often die within hours.
Someone described the first attack as like getting hit in the back with a pickaxe. Boom, and you're down.
Businessmen faced pressure to close the canal.
The argument held that the economic consequences that would result if the canal shut down would be really terrible, and so cholera arrived with a canal boat in 1849.
For the next 6 years, cholera came on lake schooners, bringing immigrants from the east, and on trains. A German wrote of his train being stoned. Cholera, it was believed, was spread by filthy water and noxious fumes, death fogs produced by exposed sewage. Gutters ran with filth, an editor thundered, at which the very swine turn up their noses in supreme disgust.
Chicago started in a swamp. It started in the most unlikely of locations where you never would have chosen to build a city if you had any choice about it at all. But once this growth happens, once all these railroad lines are pointed toward this location, once all this capital has rearranged geography in the way that it does, there is such an enormous incentive to make this site work come hell or high water.
The city hired Ellis Chesbrough from Boston, one of the best sanitary engineers in the country. He built sewers above the swampy ground so waste could flow by gravity into the river. Chesbrough then dredged the river and used the fill to raise the ground level 10 feet. The challenge then was to raise the buildings. For that, he turned to George Mortimer Pullman. Son of a carpenter, Pullman dropped out of school after the 4th grade and apprenticed as a cabinet maker. In the early 1850s, he moved to Rochester and perfected a system of moving buildings when the Erie Canal was widened by jacking them up. George Pullman would jack up Chicago.
The Pullman method was to put the foundation of the building on jacks that could be turned. Each individual would be responsible for, let's say, 4 jacks, and would give each one a quarter turn at a time. You might have 1,000 jacks around the base of a big building, and 250 men blow a whistle, and they'd all turn one of those, a quarter turn or an eighth of a turn or something. And little by little, they would jack up the building, and other people would be putting bricks in around to shore up the foundation.
As hotels were raised, diners enjoyed, without interruption, broiled Lake Michigan whitefish à la maître d'hôtel. Chateau Lafitte with their mutton au jus was $5 a quart.
Chicago was a city, it was mud, there was Fort Dinner, was mud. But they did it. They hoisted it and they moved houses. It was mud. I remember interviewing some old woman, she was about 98, when I interviewed her about 35 years ago. So she remembers the mud and the wooden walks and the junk and the effluvium and everything that was there on the ground.
The sewers worked as planned. draining waste from the city into the river. There, it mixed with waste from the stockyards, which flowed into a tributary of the South Branch known as Bubbly Creek, from the carbolic acid which rose from discarded, decaying animal parts.
One of the McCormicks writes to the old man who's in Paris trying to sell his reapers. "Pop," he said, "I was up at Clark Street Bridge and I'm looking and the river's scarlet." Can you imagine that? There's heads of pigs in the river and things like that. And this is what's flowing out into the lake.
The lake was Chicago's water supply, and it already had problems.
The intake was not well filtered at the time. Minnows would get into the water system, and you could turn on the tap and have a fish fall out. There is a line in one of the books of the time describing bathing as a piscatorial pastime. There is a conviction of one Chicago liquor dealer for watering his booze when a pickled minnow was found in the whiskey.
Chesbro was hired to develop a new water system. Clean water from the lake bottom would pour into intakes under a crib 2 miles into Lake Michigan. It would flow by gravity through a tunnel 30 feet below the lake to a pumping station. Then up the 138-foot pipe of a new water tower, from which it would flow into the city's water mains. Immigrants were hoisted down shafts to work 16-hour shifts under Lake Michigan. It was at the time the longest tunnel excavation in history. A contemporary wrote, "To the timid, the situation would be a horrible one. The thought that Lake Michigan had broken in and would bury them in the deep grave dug by their own hands would drive them mad. They would imagine the earth caving in on them and engulfing them in a living tomb. They would conjure up demons in the darkness and see horrible shapes in the smoke of the lamps. If all the people of Chicago had been of this sort," he wrote, "we should have drank foul water all our days." Chicago's mayor called the tunnel the wonder of America and the world. When the floodgates of the crib were opened in 1867, a reporter for Harper's Weekly wrote, "The water went down with a roar of an infant Niagara." The water project never worked. Spring rains washed sewage 2 miles out into the lake, right into the water intakes. Chesbro would have another chance.
Chesbro says the way we're going to solve this thing is to do something nobody's ever done in the history of the world. We're going to tell a river to go where God didn't want it to go. We're going to send it another way. We're going to reverse the damn thing. And everyone thought, little cuckoo here, but he did it.
To reverse the river's flow, the canal was deepened to eliminate locks that raised boats to the height of land. The river would no longer flow east into Lake Michigan, but west from the lake into the canal and down to the Illinois River. When the project was completed, straw was thrown on the river. At first, it appeared to head east toward the lake. Slowly, it began to head west toward the canal and the Illinois River and the Mississippi. businessmen honored Chesbro for purifying the river without interfering with the city's business or its unparalleled growth.
That's the beauty of Chesbro to the city fathers. He comes in, technology will solve it. Technology will solve it. He's fed it at banquets because he allows Chicago to grow without changing anybody's behavior, without controlling any of the economic interests who are dumping in the river. And they can continue to use that river as a sewer and send that garbage downriver toward less powerful and complaining canal towns.
The stench has been almost unendurable, wrote a downstream resident. What right has Chicago to reduce the value of property and bring sickness and death to the citizens? Chicago's elite cared just as little about its own population, the half that were immigrants. Germans who came to Chicago beginning in the 1850s brought their old world traditions with them. They enjoyed lager beer at